So let's talk bolts, flamers, and energy blasts. Today we're going to look at one efficient gun for every single faction in Warhammer 40K. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today we're going to do another video going through every single faction in Warhammer, and this time talking about one efficient weapon for every single one of the factions in the entire game. For this one, I thought we'd look at one potentially strong shooting option in every single codex. Obviously there's going to be a lot of different choices there. It's kind of hard to weigh up things like anti-infantry versus anti-tank weapons, so I'm not necessarily saying that every choice that we look at is going to be the strongest gun platform in the whole codex, but just one source of firepower that I think is really quite interesting and could see play. We'll go through the Imperium, Chaos and Xenos in that order, and of course this will be a little bit limited in scope. If you think there's a better or more fun gun in each faction, feel free to let me know down in the comments. I certainly feel like this is the sort of video that I could do a part 2 for if you guys are interested. In any case, let's jump straight in and start with the Space Marines. Seeing as Space Marines are a bit of a weird case where they both have a core codex and then a bunch of little supplements, I thought we'd just take a look at one gun from the core one and then a few examples from the supplements without turning this into an entire Space Marine video. In any case, for the Adeptus Astartes, I thought we'd start with talking about multi-melters and grav cannons, slightly shorter range options than most for the Devastators. The multi-melters obliterating enemy vehicles by beams of heat, and the grav cannons crushing elite infantry under the weight of their own armour. It's quite a popular choice within Space Marine lists to load up a couple of each of these into a Devastator drop pod, maybe 2 or 3 grav cannons combined with 1 or 2 multi-melters plus an Armorium Cherub, and probably packing a second squad of Devastators into the same drop pod for maximal use of the transport capacity. Then deep strike them towards the enemy turn 1, and you've got a pretty apocalyptic Alpha Strike unit there. Depending on what target you're facing, you can either put the Armorium Cherub and the Devastator Sergeant Signum into the grav cannons or the multi-melters, depending on whether or not you want to crush elite infantry or melt tanks. The tactic probably works best in Iron Hands, as in the first turn they get to reroll hit rolls of 1 innately for those heavy weapons, and also don't take any penalty for moving and shooting heavy weapons, means they'll all be hitting on 3s or better. In any case, just for the single squad of Devastators, never mind if you have 2, just with average rolling you'll do around about 4 dead marines from the grav cannons, and then if you can get within 12 inches of a toughness 7 vehicle, the multi-melters with the Signum and the Armorium Cherub do a crazy 20 wounds or so. They could easily make their value back then and there, never mind the fact that you can cram 2 of these Devastator squads into one pod. Just for a few other random scattergun examples within the Space Marine chapters, maybe a few of the standout ones are Dark Angels coupled with Plasma Inceptors. Their handheld super-pleated plasma exterminators and weapons of the Dark Age all strike with strength 8, AP-3 and a flat damage 3, and you'll be getting 4 shots per guy against most targets, or potentially up to 6 if you're targeting a big infantry unit. Deep strike them into range of say a company master, and you've got about 26 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, 20 wounds to a toughness 8 one, or entire squads of Space Marines just obliterated like that. They are quite expensive though, and they do have the chance of overheating. For Deathwatch, I think they're one of the chapters that make some of the best use of the twin Volkite culverins. Volkite weapons being Heresy-era heat rays, potentially causing exposed organic matter to burst into flame. They're quite hard to manufacture, so you don't see as many of them about in the 41st millennium. On the board, Deathwatch can make great use of them, particularly the Contemptor Dreadnoughts with the twin Volkite culverins. For 170 points they get a pretty whopping 16 strength 6 AP0 damage 2 shots with mortals on 6s. And for Deathwatch in particular, it combines amazingly well with the Tome of Ectoclades, the one that allows core units nearby to reroll wounds against a certain target. It's pretty amazing with their low strength, and also means you're going to be getting a whole stack of mortal wounds. For the Raven Guard, a potentially fun sniper character can take Ex Tenebris. This one's a 36-inch range sniper rifle that turns a character into really quite a dangerous killer. You get 3 shots at strength 4 AP-2 damage 2, you ignore lookout sir, get +1 to hit, ignore cover, and it's massively dangerous in the Raven Guard tactical doctrine, as you also get +1 to wound against characters as well. For the Salamanders, a fun choice could be a Combi Melter or Combi Flamer drop pod. Combi weapons combine the best bits of a bolter with a special weapon of some kind, and Salamanders particularly get on with anything that cooks the enemy with heat. Drop them down in turn 2 in the Salamander's tactical doctrine, and you get +1 to wounds. If you choose the Flamers, in theory you could have 60 shots at strength 4 AP-1 damage 1 coming out of them, as they have a stratagem that allows them to get maximal shots out of their random shot weapons. Finally, for the Ultramarines, I think perhaps it's hard not to mention just the standard bolt rifle in the hands of a Space Marine intercessor. Mass reactive explosive shells fired at fairly long range and even more dangerous than the standard bolt gun. Not bad as the standard armament for a Primaris Space Marine. With Scions of Guilliman, the Ultramarines basically love any rapid fire weapons, being able to move and shoot twice at 30 inches, usually at AP-2 when they're in tactical doctrine, and Ultramarines do character castles very well, potentially having very good rerolls to hit with Marnius Calgar or Guilliman, and just about every gun in the arsenal gets quite dangerous if you combine it with the Seal of Oath, their relic that allows you full rerolls to hit and wound against one given target. Combine those kind of rerolls with things like a Chaplain Litany for +1 to wound, and maybe even the rapid fire stratagem to shoot them twice, and standard bolters can shred just about most things in the game. Outside of the core Space Marine Codex, we come to the Adeptus Custodes, and it's kind of hard not to talk about their salvo launchers on the Virtus Praetors these days. Jet bike mounted melter missiles that are pretty much death incarnate to tanks and armoured targets, and shot very accurately with the great ballistic skill of the Custodes. It's 255 points for 3 versus Praetors, and they're very likely to get the missiles exactly where they need to be with their 14-inch move, then 24-inch threat range after that. Each one fires out a single shot at strength 8, AP-4, damage D3 plus 3, hitting on 2s. They can often pick up rerolls to hit with Custodes shield captains, and will usually have a single reroll to wound as well from the Emperor's Chosen Shield Company. Even just a few scattered shots with these can really ruin tanks' days. Turn on turn average, you get around about 12 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle without an invul. At least a reasonable chance to one shot kill it, though of course it is going to be quite swingy. Or around about 7 wounds to a toughness 8 vehicle with a 5+ invul. Of course that's very much only part of the story, as they get to fire those and then charge in with those interceptor lances for a massive charge damage as well. Next up we have the Adeptus Mechanicus, and for these mechanically augmented cyborgs, the galvanic rifle carried by their standard Skitarii Rangers is one of the more threatening things in the book. When the rifle bullets impact upon a target, they convert any potential energy that the target has into a big explosion of electric force, so they do have really quite a bite to them. In game they're heavy 2 weapons with 38-inch range, 2 shots at strength 4, AP-1, damage 1 for only 9 points per model. As they come in really big squads, you could have 20 rifles with an Omnispex to ignore's cover for 190 points. Perhaps the biggest thing about the AdMech is just how easy they find it to get all their buffs. They get +6-inch range, an AP-1 better from a Tech Priest Manipulus, and they can have reroll 1s to hit and wound from a Skitarii Marshal. They can move and shoot with a Skitarii Warlord trait, and they can get 3 shots out of those rifles for 2 CP. I feel like those are some of the most obvious buffs, but you can get much more. Say they could be in Protector Doctrina for +1 to hit, or use Wrath of Mars for mortal wounds on 6s. In any case, just using this unit with the buffs that I talked about, the Manipulus, Marshal, and the 3-shot stratagem, this big block of OBSEC troops can kill around 36 dead guardsmen, 13 dead Space Marines, or around about 18 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. So in theory that could be 2 dreadnoughts dead in a turn maybe. Definitely requires a bit of investment, but that's kind of hilariously terrifying damage dealing out of a simple troops choice. Next up we come to the Imperial Guard, or the Astra Militarum, and here we have the trusty Demolisher Cannon, close range enormous siege shells designed for punching through the toughest enemy fortifications and armour. Perhaps in terms of damage output, the most efficient at the moment is to use a Tank Commander for 200 points, equip it with a las cannon, and at 24 inches that's 2d6 shots at strength 10 AP-3 damage d6, plus of course the las cannon shot. Hitting on 3s means it's a bit less vulnerable to modifiers, and you can order its own crew to reroll 1s to hit as well, further increasing the damage. In terms of anti-tank firepower, it's easily one of the strongest choices in the Imperial Guard, and outshines a lot of options by a really long way. You can augment it with a few stratagems and things. Hail of Fire for 2 CP automatically gets you 12 shots at that profile, which is kind of hilariously terrifying. That is only usable against vehicles though. You can use Vengeance for Cadia for reroll all hits and wounds against Chaos targets, and there's a few stratagems from the new Cadian supplement that are also kind of interesting. Some regiments or custom regiments can give you an extra 6-inch range, which helps with the low threat range. The Cadians can reroll 1s if they're stationary, or the number of shots with their tank order, and Cassachans or gunnery experts can also reroll the number of shots too. You could potentially even make it a tank ace as well, maybe for something like reroll 1s to wound. In general though, they're just really quite a good workhorse unit for the guard, actually dealing efficient damage unlike a lot of their other units. With reroll 1s to hit and rerolling the number of shots from a regiment, you average around about 4 or 5 dead Space Marines, around 12 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, or about 6 wounds to a really hard target with toughness 8, a 5+ invul and -1 damage, which is still pretty impressive considering. The Sisters of Battle love their holy trinity of weapons, bolters, flamers and melters to purge the witch, and their flamers are particularly bitey, getting +1 strength compared with virtually anything else in the game. Their Ministorum hand flamers are fun flamer pistols that hit just as hard as a regular flamer for other factions, and probably the most efficient way of fielding them in the Codex is with a Seraphim squad. You can get a unit for 90 points with 3 sets of 2 bolt pistols, and then 2 sisters packing a pair of these Ministorum flamers. Dropping in from Deep Strike Reserve 9 inches away means they're already in range, then you can use Deadly Descent for 1 CP. That allows the unit to shoot in the movement phase, and then also shoot in the shooting phase again. Essentially, between the bolters and the hand flamers, you're averaging 36 strength 4 hits on their targets. You would just need to be careful that you don't do so much damage in the movement phase that you're not going to be out of range in the shooting phase. In general though, they just seem pretty much designed for dropping in, roasting enemy objective holding units. In theory, kill around about 24 guardsmen, 10 orcs or 3 dead space marines, so hopefully a good choice for roasting enemy backfield objective holders and jumping up to hold the objectives next turn perhaps. If you're playing Ebon Chalice as well, you could potentially even add some mortal wounds into the mix as well, a 1 CP stratagem for a very high chance of getting 3 of them. For the Grey Knight demon hunting space marines, it's kind of hard not to talk about the Dread Knight guns, the Gatling silencer and heavy psi cannon, the big versions of the standard Grey Knight psi weapons, which fire silver-tipped, ritual-inscribed bullets, capable of bypassing most arcane protection, and as the bearer is a psyker, is able to infuse their own psychic might into their shooting attacks, lending yet more damage. Dread Knights remain pretty much all-round strong, and their current favoured armament is usually taking both of these, 40 points in total as an upgrade on the Dread Knight chassis for 12 shots at strength 5, AP-1 damage 1 from the silencer, and 6 shots at strength 8, AP-2 and damage 2 from the psi cannon. For 40 points on an already efficient chassis, it's a really good deal, and there really are quite a lot of good buffs available. The Swordbearer's Brotherhood can give you +1 to wound via their psychic power, or +1 to hit via a stratagem. A Grandmaster could give you +1 damage from Empiric Amplification, that makes them far better against hard targets. You could get extra range from Tides of the Warp, rerolls from nearby Grandmaster Dread Knights, and they do have a handy 1 CP stratagem for +1 AP and +1 strength on all their guns. Again, really relevant if you're shooting against something with a high save. If we do a bit of Dread Knight focusing fire though, say you manage to cast the Swordbearer's power and Empiric Amplification on 1 key target, each individual Dread Knight that shoots at that target will average around about 9 dead guardsmen, 5 or 6 dead space marines, or around about 10 or 11 wounds to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle. Basically, one Dread Knight is going to have a fairly reasonable chance of ending most normal sized targets in 1 volley of fire, never mind the fact that you might have multiple, and you can also follow that up with a massive charge in with that big Nemesis Greatsword. For the Imperial Knights, they have really quite a lot of fun big guns. The Knights are covered in enormous shooting weapons, which you can make into a whole nother level of threat by souping them up with relics or warlord traits. One that's pretty much always been a staple is Endless Fury, the Relic Avenger Gatling cannon that is almost guaranteed to leave a decent mark on virtually whatever you point it at. Obviously there's quite a lot of other good fun shooting relics out there, Call's Wrath for the Castellan for example. Knight relics on enormous guns do tend to be quite fun. In any case, the standard Avenger gets 12 shots at strength 6, AP-2 and damage 2, pretty ideally suited for murdering space marines, though it is going to do some very nasty damage to light vehicles as well, and absolutely chew through hordes. Endless Fury boosted in 2 different ways, getting 14 shots base, and also getting exploding 6s to hit as well, which means that rather than getting an average of 8 hits on your target, you get more like 11 or 12 with Endless Fury, plus it's also a lot more useful against things that give you -1 ballistic skill, or against knight degrading profiles if you were hitting on a lower number. Just in a standard burst of shooting from this thing, you can expect around about 5 dead standard sized space marines, around 10 dead guardsmen, or somewhere around 4 or 6 wounds to most normal sized vehicles, getting a bit better than that if they're fairly low toughness at toughness 6. I think it's rarely going to be a particularly bad option, though of course it can struggle against damage -1 things, and it does combine very nicely with First Knight from Crast, the one that allows you to reroll 1s to hit. Finally, for the loyalist forces of mankind, we have the Imperial Agents, and I thought perhaps a fun one to focus on might be the Drukhari weaponsmiths, the sanctioned Xenos inquisitorial henchmen that while having no obvious form of language, they have an innate technological mastery, and will generally sport several miniaturized weapons capable of surprisingly intense energy discharges. In game, they are inquisitorial henchmen, which does mean that they're quite rarely fielded in any sort of optimized list, as it tends to be a lot easier to field inquisitors with the Imperial Agents rule within other detachments, but if you were fielding a big Inquisitor detachment, then they're actually quite good fun for 20 points, I think. Their Drukhari weapons either get a single anti-tank shot at strength 8, AP-3 and damage 3, or a more anti-infantry scatter shot with 6 shots at strength 4, AP-1 and damage 1 up close. Each turn, each Drukhari gets to roll a d3 and either re-roll the hit roll, re-roll the wound roll, or re-roll both, and a battery of them can actually put out some surprisingly efficient damage. Turn on turn, they'll average somewhere around 3.5 to 4 wounds on toughness 7 vehicles, or around 7 or 8 dead guardsmen up close. I think overall really not too bad firepower for something that's character protected, really cheap at 20 points, and not even all that easy to remove as well, as they do have 3 wounds. As I said, pretty impractical for fielding in actual games due to detachment rules, plus they would give up very easy assassinate points, which might not be the best either, but quite fun for very cheap little monkeys that can potentially punch far above their suspected weight. Into the forces of Chaos now, and for the Chaos Space Marines, I couldn't help but talk about the Soul Burner Petard for the Chaos Decimator. The Decimator's a fairly lightweight Chaos War mech from Forge World, an unholy formation of an unwilling demon host bound to a malevolent machine, and the Soul Burners spit out some high explosive rounds, particularly vicious against infantry. It's 180 points for a Decimator with 2 of the Assault Burners. They're both Assault 2d3 weapons with 24-inch range, and every unmodified wound roll of a 2+ causes 1 mortal wound on the target, and the attack sequence ends. It works very nicely indeed with a Master of Possession around, as they've got a spell to allow reroll 1s to hit and wound, and also the potential for a 4+ invul save to help keep these demon engines safe as they advance up. I think perhaps the scariest thing about these guys is their reliability. They're usually going to average around about 6 mortal wounds against just about anything, going to be quite reliably killing a squad of 5 1-wound infantry just like that, and mortal wounds plough through most heavy defences, things like good armour saves or invuls. They will definitely be a bit weaker against anything with feel no pains against mortal wounds, say Black Templars or the Custodes Emperor's Chosen, but still seeing a few of these things is pretty terrifying on the other side of the battlefield. They're almost guaranteed to get some decent damage through. For the Chaos Demons, you don't always need to carry a gun, if you can have bounding flamethrowers of Tzeentch jumping alongside you, essentially living weapons that belch out warp fire. Flamers I think are one of the more competitive units in the Demon Codex right now. They drop down to 20 points per model in the recent chapter approved, so you can have a 9-strong squad for 180 points. The Flames are kind of okay in their own right, at strength 4, AP-1 and damage 1, and being pistols is kind of handy as well, so they can fire in melee if they're locked up. Perhaps one of the most efficient ways to use them though is to get them near to a Tzeentch Herald, give them +1 strength for his aura, +1 to wound from flickering flames the psychic power, and then you can supplement that with a stratagem for mortal wounds on 6s for 1 CP. Between that little lot, you've got a bunch of strength 5 AP-1 guns that have +1 to wound. With the mortal wounds as well, you're going to have pretty reliable damage against just about anything. With average rolling, that's about 27 dead guardsmen, 9 dead space marines with 2 wounds, and then you can even toast enemy vehicles to death as well, averaging around about 13 wounds to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle. Quite nice that it doesn't care about -1 damage characteristics either. For the Death Guard, a much hated weapon from their foes is the Plague Burst Mortar, the primary armament of the Plague Burst Crawler. These things fire barrages of high explosive shells that are also laden with demonic spores that eat into and corrode anything that they touch, whether it's flesh or metal. The combination makes them intensely dangerous, and Plague Burst Crawlers are basically one of the most efficient Death Guard units in the whole Codex now, 160 points after their unexpected points drop. The mortar being a very nice barrage weapon at d6 shots, strength 8, AP-2, damage 2, and a plague weapon, and the 2 entropy cannons giving you 2 shots at 36 inches, strength 8, AP-4, and a big damage d3 +3. All that is just ridiculously good firepower on a model that's one of the toughest vehicles in all of 40k. These things are always going to be a bit of a nuisance just sitting around in the backfield. 3 Plague Burst mortars focusing fire can do quite a number on just about anything hiding out of line of sight. They average around about 7 dead guardsmen, 4 or 5 dead space marines, or about 7 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, so given a turn or 2 they should generally be able to chew through most squads. Really quite nice when they could kill something really key, perhaps a fragile unit that was hiding, or something capturing a key objective. The entropy cannons can do a lot of damage to vehicles in direct line of sight though. If they're all in range they do around about 15 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle on average, or around 7 or 8 wounds to a toughness 8 vehicle with a 5+ invul. For a trio that's less than 500 points, that's monstrously efficient, particularly as they're so hard to kill. Finally, Disgusting Force is a useful stratagem for the Plague Burst Mortar, a 1 command point 1 to make the mortar damage 3. Very nice if you happen to be shooting against heavy targets or 3 wound infantry. Plus every enemy unit within 3 inches of their target will get some splash damage, roll a 4+ for each one to deal 1 mortal wound. A little bit scattergun that one, but when shot at the right target that could actually add up to a fair few mortal wounds. For the Thousand Suns, I thought we'd mention the Inferno Combi Bolters. The sorcerers imbuing the bolts in advance with magical energies that, as well as the regular explosive power of a bolt gun, it has additional armor punching power. The sorcerer's discharges melting through flesh and ceramite. The Combi Bolters are the standard armament of the Scarab Occult Terminators. A pretty awesome battle line for the Thousand Suns, generally all-round tough, reasonable in combat, do a bit of psychic, but their shooting certainly isn't to be underestimated. A big unit of these Combi Bolters can do plenty of damage when buffed up, and particularly gets even more efficient if you throw a few Soul Reaper cannons or Hellfire missiles in there. Say you had a big squad of Scarab Occults slogging up the board, shielding an Exalted Sorcerer and an Infernal Master, you really can apply quite a ton of scary buffs to the unit. Reroll 1s to hit from the Sorcerer, +1 strength from the Infernal Master, +1 to wound for 2 CP from Wrath of the Wronged, a stratagem that you could use either in the shooting or the fight phase, and +1 to hit from Presage. That still gives you a fair few casts left over for either direct damage dealing or making the squad tougher. That squad's going to have really well-rounded damage though, 40 shots at strength 5, AP -2, with +1 to wound, +1 to hit, and re-rolling 1s. It'll just obliterate 1 wound infantry with around about 32 dead guardsmen, kills around about 10 dead space marines on average, or does 13 wounds to a toughness 7 or 8 vehicle, basically just melting straight through a battle tank with small arms. In general though, it is only going to get nastier if you swap in a few Hellfire missiles or Soul Reapers as well. They can make equally good use of most of those buffs. For the Chaos Knights, I've chosen to include the Lightning Cannon from the Questa Megara, a weapon that I think is particularly susceptible to being souped up with demonic energies. The Lightning Cannon basically fires massive bolts of electricity, strong enough to blast apart battle tanks, and also has a tendency to chain to other nearby targets, bounds of electricity leaping from one unit to the next. In-game, it's the Questa Megara's main gun, usually 8 shots at strength 7 and damage 3 with exploding 6s, but it does work really quite well with the Infernal Household Devotion. You take D3 mortal wounds on your knights, and in reward the demons reward you with +1 strength and +1 damage to the gun. That'll make it strength 8, AP -2, damage 4. It ignores covers at base, and you could get some potential rerolls from a household buff maybe. In any case, 1 round of shooting on average will do around about 14 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, 11 wounds to a toughness 8 one, or kill around 2 or 3 toughness 5 infantry with 3 wounds. There's quite a few guns that really can do quite well with this Infernal Household upgrade. It works quite well with the War Dog Moiraxes as well, with things like their Lightning Locks or Volkite Vuglares. Moving on to the Xenos now, and for the Craftworld Eldar we have the D-Cannon. Eldar Distort weapons being the ones that basically rip a hole into the warp. The weapon basically bending the fabric of reality itself to rip the target apart regardless of any arcane protections. The D-Cannon is basically the field artillery example of this technology. In-game is present as 65-point support battery weapons. They fire as artillery so can target things out of line of sight, but do have a relatively short range at 24 inches. Despite this though, their damage output really is very scary indeed. D3 shots at strength 12, AP -4, and a huge D6 +2 damage, plus mortal wounds on a wound roll of a 6. It perhaps works particularly well in Ulthway. They get a free reroll each time the unit shoots, and if you have a unit of 3 of them, then they are a good target for the Guardian strat, the one that gives them +1 to hit for the unit, really quite good value on 195 points worth of models. A unit like this just seems like a pretty scary area denial weapon. Nothing enormously special against infantry, 7 dead guardsmen or 4 dead space marines, though it works equally well on things like Gravis marines. But when you point at them at a hard target, it's really just going to blast them straight off the board. You average around about 23 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle, or even 14 wounds to a pretty hard target, a toughness 8 vehicle with a 5+ invul and -1 damage. If you can set them up in such a way that they're hidden from line of sight and also have range on a few mid-board objectives, then they're going to make life difficult for your opponent, particularly if they need to advance forward with tough stuff. For the Harlequins, I was quite tempted to talk about the Void Weaver, but we kind of covered that quite recently in a different video if you did want to search that up. For a change, I thought we'd talk about the Shrieker Cannon on the Death Jester, a 55-point character, and I'd argue one of the strongest sniping units in 40k right now. The Shrieker Cannon is basically a relic shuriken cannon, coated with lethal toxins that have the potential to turn the target into a living bomb. In game, this manifests itself as an Assault 3 weapon with 30-inch range, Strength 6, AP-2, and Damage 2, hitting on Ballistic Skill 2+, can target characters freely, gets extra AP on 6s with the Shuriken special rule, and the Spectacular Demise means that enemy units count the models as twice the models slain for morale purposes. If you want to get the maximum amount of Shrieker Death into a Harlequins list, then for 220 points, you could theoretically take all 3 of them with 3 different pivotal roles. I feel like they're all kind of okay, though you could just choose to run them cheap. If you take the rolls, one then can cancel Overwatch and mess with enemy movement, one gets 3 extra hits on hit rolls of 6, and one gets ignores cover and a mortal wound each time you roll a wound roll of a 4+. They should be pretty mobile getting around the board as well. In the Mask of Light, they can advance and shoot for no penalty, or they could even potentially ride in a Starweaver transport. It would seem very, very hard to hide enemy characters from their reach then. In any case, if they can draw a bead on an enemy character, on average they're going to do around about 11 wounds to Toughness 3 characters with a 5+ invul, and around 7 or 8 wounds to say a Space Marine Captain, a Toughness 4 character with a 4+ invul. Even if they can't hit characters though, they're not going to be all that bad against shooting against elite infantry. The trio would average around 8 dead guardsmen, 4 or 5 dead Space Marines, and vehicles will take on average between 4 or 6 wounds. If they do injure but not kill any squads, they're going to be testing for leadership on quite a low test. Say killing 4 Marines is going to have them testing on a -8 leadership, should be an auto fail and 1 more Marine running at least. Potentially fairly terrifying, as with character protection, it might be very hard to get to grips with them, either shoot them back or charge them with that long range. For the Drukhari, maybe one of the sensible answers might just have been a whole ton of Dark Lances, but I thought it might be fun to mention the Hex Rifle on Rax, perhaps one of the slightly lesser known bits of kit on the unit that actually turns into a very potent weapon if you combine it with Dark Technomancers. These rifles are again a very weird bit of Eldar kit. They shoot out a vial of a glass plague virus. If it strikes enemy exposed flesh, the entire target can be gradually turned into a glass statue over the next few seconds as the virus eats away at it. In general, Raks are one of the most efficient units in the Codex, great for objective holding and a bit of melee skirmishing, but if you were taking Dark Technomancers, then a Hex Rifle for 5 points seems like a really great upgrade. Just at base, it's a heavy one-shot at Strength 6, AP-2, Damage 2, can target characters and do mortal wounds on 6s, and if you overcharge it with Dark Technomancers, you get +1 to wound and damage 3 out of that shooting, and if you take the mortal wound, you can take it on a regular rack. If you were bringing along some racks anyway, then this could actually put out some surprising amount of damage. A trio of squads will average around about 3 or 4 wounds to a Space Marine character each turn, or 2 or 3 wounds to a Toughness 7 or 8 vehicle. Obviously not particularly exciting compared with dedicated shooting units, but seeing as there's a good chance you might want to field racks anyway to hold objectives and stuff, it seems like this amount of damage output at a good range each turn seems pretty decent for an extra 15-point upgrade. On to the Tyranids next. Things are surely going to change in their new codex somewhat, but at the moment Tyranid termagants with Devourers really can put out a spectacular hail of living ammunition with which to devour the enemy from afar. Devourers are essentially a semi-rotting lump of living flesh, infested by horrendous black shiny flesh worms, an electric jolt sending them hurtling straight towards the enemy, immediately and painfully burrowing into the exposed enemy's skin, if not swiftly removed, then aiming for the nervous system and burrowing towards the target's brain. Again, another very horrible way to die in 40k. For termagants though, they can really field these horrors en masse, a 2-point upgrade over their base 5 points, and that'll spit out 3 strength 4 worms. In a huge squad of 30 termagants, that's going to be 210 points for a whopping 90 shots. You get to reroll 1s to wound when they're in large numbers, and you can spend 2 CP to make the squad fire twice, which basically means you have a big unit of Auspex troops that's going to be spitting out a crazy 180 strength 4 shots at 18-inch range. That kind of volume fire going to be having a good effect against just about anything, and of course will massacre infantry. Theoretically, you could get a few other buffs as well. Leviathan could get exploding 6s for 1 CP, or Kronos could get similar with their psychic power Symbiostorm. You can deep strike the squad to get them in range with a Trigon or a Lictor, or just use the Swarm Lord's double movement to get the squad to move up the board very rapidly. If you do that way, in theory you could use things like Synaptic Links or rerolls to hit from Leviathan commanders if you're starting on the board. In any case, if you do just manage to get exploding 6s from somewhere on them, fire them twice for 2 CP, and you're going to be averaging about 53 dead guardsmen, 10 dead Space Marines, or 13 wounds to a Toughness 7 vehicle. Plus you get to roll a crazy amount of dice as well, a very impressive amount of living weapons hurled at the enemy. For the Genestealer Cult, I thought we'd talk some Crossfire. where I feel that if you want to make big hitting neophyte hybrids work, seismic cannons and shotguns might well give you some of the best bang for your buck. Seismic cannons are repurposed Imperial mining gear. They send out pulsed bow waves of sonic force, designed for blasting apart rubble and rock faces, but they seem to work pretty well against enemy infantry and armour as well. For a general purpose threat, you could have 195 points for 20 neophytes, 16 with strength 4 2-shot shotguns, and 4 with the big seismic cannons. You can deep strike them with Colt Ambush anywhere that's greater than 6 inches from the enemy, so they're really hard to screen, and a cheap upgrade will give them automatic crossfire exposed on their targets for +1 to hit, +1 to wound, and also ignores cover if they're close. Have them pop up next to a Primus for reroll 1s to hit and wound, while he hopefully also buffs other units and maybe aims for a charge as well. And you've got a pop-up threat that's going to do at least a reasonable amount of damage to quite a lot of targets. The seismic cannons are quite flexible, either 3 shots at strength 6 AP-2 damage 2, or 6 at strength 4 AP-1 damage 1. On average, the unit's going to strike down around about 27 guardsmen, 8 dead space marines, or 10 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. And you could certainly get a few other buffs for Genestealer Cults out there, particularly certain cult creeds can allow you to move and fire with heavy weapons, which could make them a bit more efficient when they're on the board, potentially hitting on 3s. For the technologically advanced Tau, we have the airbursting fragmentation projector, certainly a very meta weapon at the moment. These started life as experimental technology from the third sphere of expansion, a relatively close-range anti-infantry area clearance weapon. This thing boasts an onboard AI that calculates the trajectory of the projectile, and detonation controlled by a micro-drone intelligence within the small explosive itself. In-game, they've certainly been a popular toy on the crisis suits, who can now take multiple copies of them. Perhaps one typical loadout being 2 airbursts per suit, combined with something like a shield generator and a plasma rifle perhaps. The plasma rifle can plink away at some hard targets, while the airburst will throw out 2d6 strength 4 AP-1 damage 1 shots at 24-inch range, ignoring line of sight, so it can really chew through a whole ton of light infantry that the Tau can't even see. Buffs for all sorts of ranged weapons are everywhere in the Tau Codex. A marker light on your target can give you +1 ballistic skill, Montcar can give you AP-1 better if you're up close, and also advance and shoot for no penalty and reroll 1s to wound. A Crisis Commander could allow you to ignore modifiers, give you reroll 1s to hit, and even use their Warlord traits to reroll wounds up close as well. And if you needed extra AP, you could use Combined Fire, giving 2 units the option to hit the same target and get even more AP on it. You could swap out that shield generator for a free target lock, which will give you ignores cover. And then there's a whole bunch of Sept locks benefits, things like Tau Sept's +1 to wound, Fireside Enclave's drop zone clear for reroll hits and wounds, or taking a custom Sept that gives you the +1 strength when you're up close and personal with the enemy. Getting thieves to strength 5 could be very scary indeed. Just for one example, say you had a unit with 10 airbursts, a marker light on the target, Montcar active, and the Crisis Commander buff with a reroll wounds, that'd kill 24 dead guardsmen, 7 dead space marines, or 10 wounds to a toughness 7 vehicle. Really quite nice damage up close. It'll still hit targets that are further away quite decently as well, though admittedly you will lose some of the main buffing advantages. Kind of surprisingly general purpose though for what's mainly a fairly low damage anti-infantry weapon, just souped up with a whole load of buffs. And of course you've got whatever other guns that you've got on the suits as well, things like plasma rifles or Tau flamers could certainly add to the damage. Next up, for the Necrons, we have the Gauss Destructor, the heavy anti-tank version of Necron Gauss technology, ancient advanced weapons that flay their targets apart at a molecular level. Even their small arms can eat through the heaviest armour given enough time and shots, never mind this enormous thing. It's mounted on the relatively recent Locust Heavy Destroyer sculpt, a 55-point anti-tank gun mounted on a death-obsessed Necron, and perhaps one of the strongest single-shot weapon profiles that you can get for the points, a single gun at strength 10, AP-4 and damage 3d3. The destroyers have built-in reroll 1s to hit, can move and fire, and have the core keyword to allow them a few other helpful buffs, such as +1 to hit from the Overlord. The Zarrican dynasty might not be the most popular, but it can be quite good for these guys, allowing them a single reroll to hit or wound, quite good for the reliability of those big guns. And in theory you could get the full reroll wound stratagem for 2 CP. That's one that can be used on any destroyers, but I think it is a bit underwhelming to be honest. You're fairly likely to wound anyway, and I'd be a lot more tempted for a single command point wound reroll. I think it's a bit more efficient. In any case, a trio of these for 165 points, getting buffed by an Overlord for My Will Be Done, and budgeting a command reroll for a wound if you need it. They will pretty reliably end enemy anti-tank threats from a long way away. 14 wounds done to a toughness 7 vehicle, or around 7 or 8 wounds to a toughness 8 vehicle with a 5+ invul with -1 damage. Not very flexible in damage output, they're not going to do a whole load against light infantry, but they certainly do their intended role well. Last up, for the Orks, I think it's hard to go too wrong with the cobbled together construction that is the custom mega cannon. The mech guns are assembled by the big mechs, any sort of looted contraption might well go into them. Custom mega cannons tend to be the ones that discharge massive blasts of energy, though they do have an unfortunate tendency for overheating, sometimes killing their Gretchen crew in the process. A custom mega cannon is 45 points, and it gets you some pretty gloriously random firepower, d6 shots hitting on 4s, at strength 8, AP -3, and damage d6 as well. With the overcharging rule, it does hurt itself for 1 mortal wound on a hit roll of a 1. For the points, I think it's really hard to go wrong with this guy, or a few of them in spare heavy support slots. They're fairly tough with 6 wounds and the ramshackle special rule, and that firepower is really quite long range and quite general purpose. A trio of these guys for 135 points will deal you around about 3 dead marines, 10 wounds to toughness 7 vehicles, or 5 wounds to a hard target with toughness 8, a 5+ invul and -1 damage. You don't really want to take too many of them due to the terrible morale, meaning that they can easily run away if one dies, but 3 individual ones I think really aren't the worst investment at all, can give you a surprising anti-tank threat for very, very cheap indeed. So there we have it, one at least fairly decent gun for every single faction in Warhammer 40k. Hope you've enjoyed a bit of discussion about things that you might see on the other side of the tabletop. It's certainly been a good fun video to make. I definitely could try and make a follow-up video to this one at some point. There's definitely more than one fun gun per faction, and I wouldn't be against taking a look at some more. If you've enjoyed the video, feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics. I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page, and you can find that down in the video description. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, seeing certain videos early, regular votes on what sort of things come next for the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some really big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.